What is up? Welcome back to another book review. Today we're going to be talking about Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. I decided to do this book review because, well, I already owned the book, and my most watched book review is Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, so I felt like it was appropriate to do a follow-up. And Economic Facts and Fallacies is in many ways nothing new as it relates to Sowell's thinking. One thing I love about Sowell is that he's willing to talk about the tough issues. He's willing to take positions that are contrary and contrarian and stick to his intellectual guns and say things that might bother people, but he backs up his beliefs and his opinions, and so you have to respect that. This book it's not like a shortened version of basic economics, but I will say that most of the topics in this book are in some way discussed in basic economics. Maybe not every specific example, but the general ideas, I would say, are. And the purpose of the book is to talk about the different fallacies that exist in economics, in the public discourse. And the book is broken into 8 chapters. And 5 of these chapters, Sowell is talking about sort of different areas of economics where he discussed, such as urban economics, racial economics, gender economics, what are some international economics. I'm spacing on academic, maybe I didn't say that, education. So there's 5 different sections. In the beginning, he starts off by explaining what is a fallacy. He talks about the different sorts of fallacies, and just kind of gives an understanding of why fallacies persist in society and why they dominate a lot of mainstream media. And I'm going to keep this video short. I want to talk about just sort of 3 different fallacies from 3 different chapters that I thought were interesting and that were worth a little bit of commentary, I thought. The first one is from the urban section of the book, in which Sowell, again, in each section, he talks about a lot of different fallacies, and I'm just going to focus on certain topics that he talks about. But one specific topic he talks about is the fallacy of affordable housing. And he starts off by saying, government insists that affordable housing that government intervention is necessary in order to mandate affordable housing. And he goes through a couple different examples of how this plays out in terms of different policies, such as different zoning laws, and I'm actually spacing on the specific names for the policies, but he does give 2 memorable examples of California and Houston. And he looks at how in 3 different or 4 different states, I want to say it was like Vermont, New Hampshire, California, and he outlines how if you compare those housing markets to everyone else, and then you look at the time in which government decided to intervene through different policies, how in California specifically, the percentage of income that was necessary to pay for a mortgage went from 25% to 30% to 40%, and in some cases it's now 50-60% of people's income. And he ties this increase in percentage to the restrictions on zoning laws, and he contrasts this to a city like Houston, which is infamous or famous, however you look at it, for having very loose zoning laws and does not have a lot of city planning. And he says that you could think about this in the example of a builder, right? So if I am someone who constructs homes and I have been put under, let's say, a policy that necessitates I have to build a certain amount of affordable housing, or maybe, I'm trying to think, or maybe, we'll just stick with this example. You basically end up perverting incentives is what this, you can digest this to, right? Anytime that government starts intervening with policies, they pervert the incentives of the market. And sometimes you may pervert those incentives such that if I'm a builder, maybe I'm only going to build like really high-end property in real estate, because it's no longer economically feasible or desirable for me to build, say, middle class or affordable housing naturally on the market. And then he talked about this in basic economics, where if you do like rent control, right, and you start capping the amount of rent increase that is allowed and permitted, you incentivize people to stay in locations and reside in apartments that they might have otherwise moved. And you also kind of create an incentive that people who have a lot of means are able to, because you artificially suppress housing market prices, and so wealthy people are able to buy more real estate, and where they might have otherwise not have done so because the prices are kept artificially low. And yeah, I thought that was just a really interesting section. Another section that I found very, very fascinating, especially because I'm interested in going to law school, was in the academic section of the book. I think it was chapter 5 or 6, where he discusses accreditation, right? And he says something very interesting. He says that academia, by definition, almost, is a market such that consumers don't have an understanding of what they're paying for. And he goes on to talk about how this plays out in a number of dynamics, whether it be the specialization of class offerings that, and he says that is incentivized because professors sort of put a premium on their career rather teaching. He gets into the ranking systems of research universities and how, the U.S. News Report sort of gives an evaluation of university rankings, but that is mostly tied to inputs versus outputs. And so in the example of law schools, he talks about the ABA, which is the American Bar Association, and he discusses the University of Colorado's law school, which was a law school they had a law building, but they were able to keep their prices low because instead of hiring professors that they were going to put on tenure track positions, they would hire adjunct professors and local attorneys and judges who would come and teach classes, and they basically just tried to create an affordable law school, right? And what happened is that the ABA came in and threatened to take away their accreditation for a variety of reasons that Sowell outlines, but he says that the primary of these reasons was based off of the inputs, so the cost. And so they did things like used a lot of digital libraries versus spending vast resources on books and school and a law library and things like that, right? So finding shortcuts to make law school affordable. And he said that this unjustly punishes students who don't have the same sort of economic resources. And someone just walked up. So in the case of the University of Colorado, you had a law school that at one time was in tuition cost about $6,000. And because of the threat of taking away their accreditation, the law school had to put $40 million into creating a new law school building, which raised the tuition prices to about $16,000. And so you can see in this example how, but at the same time, the University of Colorado was producing high quality law students. So they weren't actually looking at the outputs because their students were passing the bar with a 92% passing rate, which he said was better than a lot of Ivy League and top tier universities. So yeah, just sort of, I thought that was interesting to think about how you can create incentives where you're not looking at the proper outputs of the economic model. And the last topic, well, he has a whole chapter where he discusses race, but in particular he discusses discrimination. And he tries to paint a picture, and this is actually one where I decided to talk about this issue because although I agree with a lot of what he says and some of his argument, I think that he doesn't give full weight to, I guess, just human subjective value and also some, I guess, psychological implications, because he talks about discrimination and he tries to paint a picture of how employment discrimination is not economically viable, in that companies, he argues, although they might engage in discrimination, they're economically incentivized not to, and if they do, they pay the economic consequences for doing so. And he gives an example of Tiger Woods. Yes, he gives an example of Tiger Woods in which he says, you have this golf star who attracts so many eyeballs, and if the PGA or whatever, ESPN, I don't know, decides that they weren't going to let Tiger Woods play or perform on TV, they would lose a bunch of revenue because he was just simply the best. And then he tries to extract this logic to what he refers to as competitive industries. And I think that he makes a really strong case for how in competitive industries, let's say it's, warehouse work, right? Or, think about like FedEx, Amazon, these type of companies, right? He says, so let's say you have FedEx and Amazon, and you have one employer who is engaging in discrimination and they don't want to hire, Black or Hispanic workers, in another company that will. So this company is hurting their bottom line because they're going to have to pay more for employees versus just allowing the free market to, allow people to decide how much their time is worth. And he goes on to give an example of how even in South Africa, which during apartheid, you had really strong regulations about employment of Blacks. He said that a lot of companies just disregarded the law and would go ahead and hire Blacks because it was economically viable to do so. And I think this is correct. I think he's correct in his explanation here. But what I disagreed with was I think he doesn't give enough weight to how things play out in sort of higher level of employment. So things such as banks or law firms. This doesn't just apply to race, this applies to gender as well, where it's hard to quantify psychological discrimination, because I think a lot of times people might have this sort of discrimination and not actually know it. But I remember in basic economics, he does try to do some side-by-side comparisons of, say, a Black lawyer who's been practicing law for 7 years and a white lawyer who's been practicing law for 7 years. But I think that it's one thing, I actually don't know this for extreme fact, but I was listening to AOC, Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, the other day when she was interviewing Jamie Dimon, and she questioned him about the differences in pay between partners at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and these different banks who were minorities versus whites. And she seemed to be pretty confident in her data and statistics. I can't really verify it. But regardless, what I do think it's hard to quantify is well, on one end, as an Austrian, I do believe in subjective value theory, right? So I do believe that, if let's say I'm Goldman Sachs and I have these two partners, maybe they're working in different areas of the company and thus produce different amounts of value to our bottom line. And so it might make sense to pay people different amounts, but I do think it's hard to really measure or talk about with any sort of empirical evidence questions of promotion, questions of employment in certain industries. I think law is a really good one to talk about, because when you think about how the law industry works, right? You start off as an analyst, you become an associate if you're lucky, and then you become a partner, hopefully, and maybe even a managing partner and a named partner or whatever the case may be. But these things are based so much on human relations, right? Like, if I'm, say, a Hispanic worker working in a law firm that is primarily Jewish, it's really hard to talk about what psychological implications could be at play in determining how far I grow in the firm, and how those could be the result of my actual work, and how much that can be the result of culture and legacy of the firm. And so I thought that was just one thing that, when I read books, I try to take in as much information as possible. I'm very open to ideas. I like ideas that push my own thinking, and I try to be very open-minded. I try to reach conclusions based off of objective reality. And I also am not afraid to push back against things that I disagree with or conclusions that are reached that I think are weak. And this was one that I thought was weak. So yeah, that's the end of this video review. Ultimately, I give this book a 3.5 stars out of 5. I wasn't that excited about the book. Basic Economics, on the other hand, 5 out of 5 stars, right? Like, and this is not a reflection of Sowell necessarily or his brilliance, but really just subjectively how I valued this book. And yeah, I give it a 3.5 stars. Maybe some of you guys are watching this and you've already watched my Basic Economics video. Maybe this is the first one you're watching, you haven't watched that video, but check it out. I talk about Thomas Sowell's magnum opus, Basic Economics, which is a great book. And Thomas Sowell is still one of my top 2 favorite economists to date. So I hope this review was interesting. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you've read the book, if you disagree with something I've said, love to hear from you. Also, follow me on Twitter, where I talk about economics, talk about Bitcoin, I talk about life. That's at @Lima_III. So thank you for watching this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.